sometimes folks who are like offering critique to the church can be just sort of seen as squeaky wheels, or it's easy. And I'll speak like as a person in leadership, in church leadership.
Sure.
Um, it's easy to sort of like have an initially defensive reaction to some of that
Yeah.
because it can feel too much like a personal critique rather than me being differentiated enough to say like this isn't a reflection of me entirely. And does this person have something to offer? And there are like inherent majority and minority cultures within every church or Christian
Yeah.
community.
Right.
And yet you talk about like the love that we see represented in scripture has to be based on mutuality, not on, seeing some folks as squeaky wheels or seeing people as folks who need to like be fixed in order to be helpful parts of the community. I think that there can be this like sense of a divine mandate that if you're in like the majority culture of a church to tell people what love actually is instead of this idea of mutuality. So I don't know
Mhm.
how would you recommend disciples of Jesus counteract this sort of like parental posture that we can have towards each other,
Oh,
and instead move towards mutuality?
oh. Well, so we write around power quite a bit in the book without it being a book about power. And we address it in many ways. I mean, the obvious ways Matt and I were different genders. Matt is a white man. I'm an Asian American woman. We're very clear about that and our social location in the book. And it has been interesting. We have had to work through some conflict involving critique
Mm,
around the book, even before it had come out, around that push back at the church. So neither of us are members at a church. I have not attended regularly church in years. And so there was a lot of question of like, well, where do you even come? Like, what is the authority you have
mm,
in writing in this tone? And so I think even in that is addressing your question, do we feel like the church is people who show up to your building every
mm,
Sunday so many times out of the 52 weeks of a year? Right. So if you even start there, I think there is an understanding of the uh, paternal relationship
mm,
and who gets to make decisions on behalf of whom. And we tried to make the case that we are two people who we actually love the church. And if there is going to be any change, we still believe that it has to come from the church. It can't come from any other institution.
mm,
Even though we are, like for me, I am currently outside of that institution, I still look at the church as being the place where the change is going to come from.
mm,
If that critique can't be heard, there's no other answer for you,
mm,
Meghan, from where I sit.
mm,
And I really wrestled with that. I wrestled with that critique, seeing it on paper, knowing that somebody had put it down. Like, how can somebody who doesn't go to church say these things? And I thought, oh, okay, I am going to reflect on that. How can
mm,
somebody I am a Christian. I still believe in Jesus. I still believe that the church is going to, has the possibility. I'm not convinced that it's going to anymore, but has the possibility of leading the way of change. But to be told by somebody in power that I shouldn't say these things and I don't have the place to say these
mm,
things made me stop and think.
mm,
Um, And I thought, oh, well, if those of us who love Jesus, who have not found a place in a pew every Sunday, have no place, then I'm not sure if this is the institution that's going to bring about change anymore.
mm,
So in that, I would say folks who are in a church and have found their regular spot in a chair that is upholstered or a hard wooden pew and anything in between. If your sense and understanding of who gets a say in what happens has more to do with how many Sundays out of the week you're present, or how much you give, or or that kind of investment gives you the power and say of what brings about change. There, we're probably having a very different conversation and a very different understanding of the church, capital C.
Mhm.
I think the local church is a different conversation. It's part of the big church, but I think a lot of the power dynamics and the push that maybe you're seeing is in that local church institution. And those rules of power and engagement, they're being negotiated on that level. And that's a hard thing as an outsider to say,
Sure.
but to make the invitation to folks at Highrock or anyone watching is your your church, little c, has power dynamics and has a
Mhm.
rule of engagement, spoken or unspoken, and an assumption that it is going to operate in a certain way. And it's probably a good opportunity any Sunday to really think about how that works
Mm.
and who gets to say
Yeah.
things need to change.
Mm.
And I would just say too, I think evangelicalism broadly, so we have a weakness in the way that we were born as a movement, right?
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
evangelicalism came into being as a contextualized outreach to a certain group of people, which is beautiful. We're doing it all over the world, and it's a good thing. It is a thing that should be done. But what happens over time is that what we have contextualized, we end up internalizing it and saying that that must be true for all people in all places. So what
Mm.
I'm saying is this: evangelicalism is a movement that was started primarily to reach white European people of a certain financial class, actually. So it's kind of middle class and above. That's what evangelicalism started as and did best. Now, it's also a very activist organization. It was reaching out to poor people, et cetera. But the core of it was middle class and upper class white folks. And at the time, just because of the era that evangelicalism began, really white men were the center
Mm.
of were the center, maybe still are the center of evangelicalism as far as power structure and as far as cultural preference and what's being put forward, right? So what ends up happening is a weakness of the evangelical church today, as we've expanded, as we've become more inclusive, right, as a community, is that our lean is still toward those places. Even
Mm.
evangelicalism culturally leans to those places still. And becoming aware of that and dealing with that is really difficult. And when we look at scripture, so part of what's happened is our preference for how power works is based in that cultural preference. But
Mm.
scripture puts all that on its head. So our lean as evangelicals is toward hierarchical. Um, which there is some of that in scripture, right? It and our lean is toward patriarchal, right? Men, especially fathers, being in charge of things, and that's also in scripture. So I'm not saying it's not scriptural, but what we see all the time in the early church is that being turned around, undermined, because blessed are the meek, right?
Mm.
Blessed
Right.
are the peacemakers, not blessed are the powerful, not blessed are the rich,
Mm.
blessed are the poor in spirit. So a great example would be when the Greek widows are not being fed in the book of Acts. They're handing out food to the poor people in their community. And the Hellenistic Jews, right? Greek by culture, Jewish women are not getting their food. And they bring that to the leadership, to the apostles, and say, you need to fix this.
Mm.
And our expectation might be, as people who are hierarchical, as people who are looking at it a certain way, that we would make a pronouncement, a rule, right? To say like, okay, now make sure that everyone is getting X number of food and et cetera, et cetera. But instead, what they do is they look to the minority population that's being overlooked and they empower them.
Mm.
So they pick some deacons, and all of them, every single one of them is a Hellenistic Jew.
Hmm.
We can tell by their names. They have Greek names. Some of them, at least one of them, they come right out and say, like, this guy's a convert. And they say, okay, the disempowered folks, we are going, we've made a mistake. We will empower the disempowered, and they're now in charge of handing out all the food because they've been slighted, and they're going to make sure no one else is. They're going to make sure everyone's taken care of, which is kind of counterintuitive to the way we sometimes think toward our lean, right, in evangelicalism, if that makes sense.
And none of them were white.
Well, there aren't a lot of white people in the Bible, Kathy.
But I think that's super helpful of saying, like, this was a practical way that scripture showed us that
Yeah.
folks who were even in a different social class were now made mutuals within the context of the church, that they were given the power and authority to
Make
help
decisions.
address. Yes.
Yeah.
Scripture sees people without power as people of particular usefulness and skill. And that people without power should be empowered because that they bring something of importance into the community. And that it's consistent throughout Scripture. It starts in the Old Testament. It goes all the way through the New, right? We're looking for shepherds to become kings, not the tall, best-looking guy who everyone thinks that guy should be king.
Yeah. And it's easy. I get it. Like it is natural. Like, I don't know.
It's pragmatic. It makes perfect sense.
Yes.
Yeah.
And when we think about the hope that is spirit powered, that seems foolish, right? Like, then you can start to believe that God would use the most unlikely people. But when most of our lives are spent looking very pragmatically about just how to like make it through the day, it's easy to revert to the easy choice socially. I get that. But it doesn't mean that it's the way of the spirit.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.